So, welcome everyone to this week's book talk. We're going to be talking about Kazuo Ishiguro's recent novel, Klara and the Sun. I feel like Kazuo Ishiguro is a writer who needs no introduction, but I love the guy, so I'm going to do it anyway. He was born in Nagasaki, moved to the UK when he was just 5 years old. And after hankering after a career as a singer-songwriter, he found himself at the University of East Anglia studying creative writing under Malcolm Bradbury and Angela Carter. His third novel, The Remains of the Day, won the Booker Prize in 1989 and brought into international attention, and was subsequently turned into a memorable film with Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson. He is not a prolific writer. He's published only 5 novels since then, although he does switch with great facility between different genres. He's given us high Arthurian fantasy, historical detective stories, science fiction, and a very, very strange and misunderstood novel about a man failing to give a piano recital. Klara and the Sun, let me just, his first book since winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2017. Klara is an artificial friend who goes to live with Josie, a young girl with a mysterious illness. Klara is not the most up-to-date model, but she is curious and observant. And through her eyes, we piece together a dystopian world adjacent to our own, an uncanny world of cones and rectangles, of lonely children, the sun's nourishment, and the sinister Cootings Machine. Told in spare elliptical prose, Klara and the Sun is an enigmatic science fiction parable that explores gene editing, societal collapse, and the power of kindness, optimism, and love. And we're very, very glad to welcome today to discuss it with us, Dr. Dominic Dean and Dr. Richard Rankin Russell. First of all, our first speaker I'm going to introduce, Dr. Richard Rankin Russell is Professor of English and Director of the Graduate Program at Baylor University, Texas. He teaches and researches modern and contemporary British and Irish literature and is the author of Seamus Heaney, A Critical Introduction, from Edinburgh University Press, and has a forthcoming book, James Joyce and Samaritan Hospitality. His published work includes articles exploring Ishiguro's complex relationship with the fantasy genre. And he is going to give us a talk today entitled Artificial Friends and the Light of Love in Ishiguro's Klara and the Sun. Richard, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Colin, and many thanks to you and Anna Mercer for setting this up. Also for Marku for running some technical support, and for my co-presenter, Dominic Dean. I assume everyone can hear me. If you can't, maybe let me know in the chat, but I think you can. And as we're seeing in the chat, Ishiguro is really a world author. I try to stress this fact to my students here at Baylor, from Nagasaki, living in Britain since the early 70s. But it's delightful to sort of see people from all over the world, including New Delhi, Turkey, Edmonton, Seattle, Portland, all over England. The real conversation and real interest there is in Ishiguro. So part of this talk draws on my opening impressions of reading the novel, and a larger part of it will try to put it in conversation with Remains of the Day, because I feel like Ishiguro has conditioned us in some ways to read this novel as a sort of reply to Remains of the Day. And in some ways, that also means he's misconditioned us, if you like, because I had a lot of expectations, perhaps like some of you, that were thankfully dashed when I finished reading the novel. And so I had certain expectations for Klara that were predicated on my reading of Stevens, and I was very, very pleased that she wasn't at all like Stevens in the end. So my opening impression is that this is very Chekhovian. What I mean by that is, especially in terms of its unhurried pace, its relatively spare plot. Some of you may know this great quote that Ishiguro told Graham Swift in a 1989 interview that, quote, "The two godlike figures in my reading experience are Chekhov and Dostoevsky," end quote. But the relatively spare canvas of this novel seems much more indebted to Chekhov. And in this regard, Ishiguro told Bill Bryson in a 1990 interview that I try to put in as little plot as possible. So when I pause in this talk, I'll be doing quotations. Of course, little plot doesn't mean no plot, as we'll see. And as I've tried to think through this novel for tonight's conversation, I've tried to consider the themes that keep coming up in Ishiguro's fiction, including dignity and duty, which occur again here, but also his interest in technology, such as the concerns with organ harvesting and Never Let Me Go. And so by this point in his career, Ishiguro seems comfortable in expecting readers to know his earlier work. In particular, I think his bestseller, The Remains of the Day. And so again, much of what I discuss in my talk today arises from my conviction that to some degree, and I don't want to over stress this at all, he's rewriting that novel in some ways with Klara and the Sun, and actually subverting expectations we might have about so-called servant literature and servant narrators that Ishiguro established there. So what do I mean by servant literature, servant narrators? There's a whole sort of subgenre of servant literature, if you like. Most famously, especially those of you in the UK may be familiar with the P.G. Wodehouse novels featuring Bertie and Wooster. There's also the underappreciated novelist Henry Green's novel Loving, a sort of upstairs, downstairs story. Chekhov's own story entitled An Anonymous Story, in which the anonymous narrator poses as a servant in Ishiguro's own Remains of the Day. But of course, Klara and the Sun seems to take the subgenre of servant literature to a new level, because it not only focuses on a servant figure, who's our narrator, but also on having that figure actually be a non-person, an AI, or if you like, an artificial friend. So are there any advantages that accrue to our actually reading Klara as an example of servant literature, especially in light of the disturbing revelations that surface in Remains of the Day, when Stevens's service to Darlington is shown in retrospect to have advanced the cause of fascism and anti-Semitism in England during the run-up to World War II. As I kept reading this novel, I felt more and more strongly that Ishiguro is taking our measure and knowingly subverting the template he set forth in that 1988 novel. What I mean is, if even belatedly, and I think it happens to all of us when we read Remains of the Day, we realize that Stevens took his service too far in embracing these pernicious ideologies. Because we know that novel so well, I think many of us do, we're conditioned then to expect a similar set of negative circumstances and repercussions when we read Klara and the Sun. That is, in thinking through Klara's unswerving devotion to her human, if you like, Josie, we're probably expecting some bad things to happen, and they do. So my fear, of course, as I went through was that Klara might blindly embrace Josie's agenda, if she had one, and she might affirm any dangerous or disturbing impulses that Josie has. And in fact, I think Klara and the Sun tries to keep raising this doubt in our minds. There's a few tips of the hat to Remains of the Day and Klara, which are likely to throw us off balance, and again, make us think some negative things are going to happen from Klara's devotion to Josie. So here's where I want to land with you, and I hope the pagination in the American novel is the same in the British edition. There's a remarkable similarity between Stevens, late in the Remains of the Day. He refuses to perform, as it were, for Lord Darlington and his friends and show off his knowledge. And the moment in Klara and the Sun, when it's the description, the long-armed girl, when the long-armed girl asks Klara to essentially perform for them at this party and tell them from memory what her sister's wearing. So in Remains, the passage in question comes fairly late in the novel. This is in 1935, when Stevens is summoned to be interrogated by one of Lord Darlington's friends. All of the men there are elitists who don't believe in democracy, not to put too fine a point on it. The context is Stevens' own refusal to believe that ordinary people should be informed on major subjects of the day, even though Stevens himself is actually informed on current events. So when Spencer questions Stevens about the debt situation regarding America, Stevens recalls, a long quote, I was naturally a little surprised by this, but then quickly saw the situation for what it was. That is to say, it was clearly expected that I be baffled by the question. Indeed, in the moment or so it took for me to perceive this and compose a suitable response, I may even have given the outward impression of struggling with the question, for I saw the gentlemen in the room exchange mirthful smiles. "I'm very sorry, sir," I said. "I am unable to be of assistance in this matter." Then the same character, Mr. Spencer, examines him again, this time about a currency agreement in Europe that might depend on an arms deal between the French and the Bolsheviks, and Stephen again feigns ignorance, stating, "I'm very sorry, sir, but I'm unable to be of assistance in this matter." And then it happens a third time. Now, this is on page 195 of my pagination and remains if you're interested. But when you go to Klara, this is on my page 79, even though the stakes are admittedly much lower, when the long-armed girl at the party urges Klara, without looking at her sister, to tell what her sister and other children at the party are wearing from memory, Klara first says, "I'm sorry," very like Stevens, then says, when the girl asks, "What do you mean, Klara? What do you mean you're sorry?" She says, "I'm sorry, I'm unable to help." So it's almost verbatim what Stevens says in Remains. Why? Why would Ishiguro do this? And does Klara, like Stevens, believe this stance is what Josie wants? Or is she offended or even mad? It's hard to tell, and I don't actually know the answer to this. I'd love to hear from someone who does tonight. But again, Ishiguro, my point is that Ishiguro seems to be conditioning us to question the motives of this new servant narrator by catapulting us back to a similar situation in Remains of the Day. Purposely feigning ignorance. I know Klara could do this from memory. She's very observant. That's maybe her best quality along with devotion. And in the process, he's going to make us question her motives by her unswerving devotion to Josie. So here's another example. When Klara stays with the mother in the car and goes on the waterfall trip without Josie, she does so in order to gain more insights into how she might care for Josie, much like Stevens does in Remains, for example, when he vows to study bantering in order to be a better servant to the new owner of Darlington Hall, Mr. Faraday. So this is on page 96 of my edition of Klara. For a second, I was uncertain what to do, and I could see how unlikely it was if I were to do so. This is to go to the waterfall trip. I would gain new, perhaps crucial insights concerning Josie's situation and how I might best help her. So again, these two situations show Klara with this unswerving devotion to Josie, willing to do anything she can for her, even look bad or unintelligent in front of others. So I'm happy to admit how wrong I was about this novel. As I read through it for the first time, I read with bated breath, waiting for the revelations to begin tumbling out, that Klara had essentially aided and abetted Josie's worst inclinations, since I have been, again, so conditioned to thinking this way from my long immersion in the Remains of the Day. Of course, and we all have our biases, my bias against a character who is artificial intelligence worked to confirm my worst instincts here with this novel. Such a character, I supposed, cannot be capable of emotion and must be robotic, not aware of herself or others' emotions. And so, again, I'm very delighted to have been proved wrong on this and a whole host of issues in this novel. When we start thinking about the question of light in the novel, the light of illumination, the light of the sun that finally seems to heal Josie, that to me seemed a good example of my own ignorance, my own expectation in reading the novels, and how I gradually was brought into the light, as it were, by Ishiguro. And I wonder if other people had similar experiences. Along these lines, I wonder if we tend to trust Klara as a narrator because she seems reliable and emotionless as an artificial friend. Stevens, of course, is a very unreliable narrator, as we come to realize. And again, most of the way through the novel, I believe that, like Stevens, she's deceived herself and continues to mitigate and qualify that deceit, even as she reveals it to us. For example, there's a scene in the novel, and many of you will probably remember this, it's on my page 159. She discovers that the sun doesn't really rest for the night in Mr. McBain's barn. Although I now had to accept the barn couldn't be the sun's actual resting place, I allowed myself an encouraging possibility that regardless of where the sun actually settled, Mr. McBain's barn was a place he made a point of calling at last thing every evening, just as Josie always visited her in suite before retiring to bed. And yet, by the end of this novel, this artificial friend, thought to be devoid of emotions, is actually much more emotional and honest than the human character Stevens. So I'm still sort of wrestling with this question of the subgenre of servant literature and how this question of emotion figures into it. It looms large here. And there's a number of moments in the novel where Klara actually seems to be just as emotional or more emotional than the mother or Josie. For example, on page 90, the mother makes clear she doesn't believe Klara has emotions when she asks her whether or not she's happy, and then says, well, what am I thinking? You don't feel happiness. And then on page 97, on the way to the waterfall, she states, it must be nice sometimes to have no feelings. I envy you. Even though Klara immediately protests, I believe I have many feelings. The more I observe, the more feelings become available to me. So while Stephen seems to have grown more stoic through his service to Lord Darlington, Klara seems to somehow ironically be gaining emotions such as sympathy. So returning to the question of how Klara might work as an example of servant fiction, why has the mother gotten Klara for Josie? As it probably dawns on many of us around halfway through the book, Josie's mother has a real fear that she's going to die like her daughter Sal did. Now, the question's only sort of just barely below the surface here, but she's been lifted. Her genes have been edited. And so there is a suggestion by Ishiguro that probably by tampering with Sal's genetics and then with Josie's, it's led to these medical conditions, and probably an example of forbidden knowledge, right? So we come to find out Klara's a proleptic replacement for Josie. There's some really disturbing passages, like on pages 103 and 104, when the mother has Klara play Josie. Okay, Klara, since Josie's not here, I want you to be Josie, just for a little while, since we're up here. So these were some pretty creepy moments for me. Then she asks Klara to move. Do something. Let me hear you speak. And the mother continues in this vein, very creepily, I might add, apologizing to Klara Josie. I'm sorry, Josie. I'm sorry I didn't bring you here today. To which Klara/Josie responds, that's okay. I know you were worried for me. I'm okay. And she finally argues, it's okay, Mom. Don't worry. I'll get well soon. I know it'll happen soon. So just to wrap up in the next few minutes, I want to complicate the question of genre at the end of this talk, which has always fascinated Ishiguro. I've recently argued how we might read or reread Remains of the Day as a sort of occluded or hidden fantasy novel by the way in which he's put it in conversation with his Arthurian novel, The Buried Giant. And of course, Klara could be, it could exemplify other genres or subgenres as well. It seems to be a sort of dystopian novel. And then in front of our eyes, it turns into a rescue narrative. Klara casts herself as the rescuer, as you know, to get the son's help in healing Josie and eliminating the Cootings Machine. And so this notion of Klara as a rescue narrative is complicated further by the possibility of its being an ecological novel or environmental narrative. But it's not set in England, a fact that emerges on page 149 when Rick's mother Helen muses, I do miss England. In particular, I miss the hedges. In England, the part of it I'm from anyway, you can see green all around you, always divided by hedges. Hedges, hedges everywhere, so ordered. She explicitly contrasts that organic, natural order with the gridded landscape of what must be a sort of planned community in front of them. Now look out there. It just goes on and on. I suppose there are fences somewhere in the midst of it all, but who can tell? So Klara, I'd like to suggest, can of course be manifold, multifold. It can be all of these. It can be servant fiction. It can be a dystopic novel. It can be a rescue narrative. I think it is an environmental novel in some ways I don't have time to get into. But I'd like to just close by thinking about Klara's unswerving devotion to Josie, which is much more positive than Stevens's devotion to Lord Darlington. And as it turns out, she had more faith than any of the supposedly rational human beings, belief in the son's power to heal Josie, which it apparently did. So at the end of the novel, as you know, Klara realizes that even if she had completely learned how to imitate Josie so she might continue her if the girl had died, she tells her manager in the scrapyard, I believe now there would have remained something beyond my reach. The mother, Rick, Melania, housekeeper, the father. I'd never have reached what they felt for Josie in their hearts. This is the moment in the novel where Ishiguro reverses, if you like, the hate that drove Stevens and Darlington and their symbiotic relationship within the remains of the day, and instead articulates the love that underpins his novel, and indeed and others to see. As Klara finally tells the manager who visits the scrapyard to which she's been relegated, she believes there was something very special, but it wasn't inside Josie. It was inside those who loved her. That's why I think now Mr. Capaldi was wrong and I wouldn't have succeeded. So I'm glad I decided as I did. Her decision seems to have been to directly invoke the help of the sun in healing Josie. Even if you think that it's a coincidence that Josie begins getting better immediately after that marvelous scene when the sun powerfully bathes her in a ferocious half disc of orange, Klara believes her intervention was crucial to saving Josie's life. And so oddly, this novel, which falls into so many different subgenres, also finally becomes a novel of belief in the supernatural from the most unbelievable and supposedly most rational source, Klara, the artificial friend. And that belief and the deep emotion articulated by her suggests strongly that our knowledge continues to be hemmed in and hindered by our prejudices against those unlike ourselves. Ironically, Klara's revelation and articulation of love comes in the scrapyard, where seemingly all artificial friends may have been discontinued by novel's end because of people's fears and prejudices against them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. That was very, very good. Our next speaker tonight, just before I introduce Dominic, just to remind everyone, we are having a Q&A after this. So please think of some questions. We have a little Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen where you can type them in and we can come back to them later. Excuse me. Our next speaker is Dr. Dominic Dean from, let's find my notes, it's the University of Sussex, where he's the lead coordinator of academic preparations for the Research Excellence Framework. As a researcher, he specializes in 20th and 21st century British fiction, children, migration, and psychoanalysis. Dr. Dean has published extensively on Ishiguro's fiction and teaches undergraduate classes in English and the medical humanities. And his talk this evening is entitled Death, Reproduction, and Religion in Ishiguro's Klara and the Sun. Can't read my own handwriting there, Dominic. Thank you very much for being with us here this evening. I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much indeed, Colin, and thank you for organising the event and having me here, and thanks for everyone for joining in. And particular thanks also to Richard for the fantastic preceding talk and giving me a really nice lead-in to my topic from the note that he ended on there as well. I have some slides just as really by way of background illustration for what I'm going to say. So I will just share those. Hopefully everyone can see those and also hear me. If that's not the case, do shout. As Colin said, my talk is entitled Death, Reproduction, and Religion in Ishiguro's Klara and the Sun. Now, Ishiguro, as an author, has long explored moral, political, and psychological problems that are created by the realities of death and reproduction. Universal realities, we might say, that are nevertheless very specifically mediated by culture, by geography and nationality, and by individual experience, of course. Now, in Ishiguro's early novels, these problems created by the realities of death and reproduction often involve problems of individual legacy in the face of some radical change in the world. Change like the disgrace of a previously celebrated employer, like Lord Darlington in The Remains of the Day, or the fall of an empire to an occupying power that was only recently deemed to be inherently racially inferior, which of course is the context of Ishiguro's first two novels set in post-war Japan. And these merge into problems also of the ultimately unknowable impact of a protagonist's life decisions after the end of their own life. And this is an absence of knowledge that is materialized, particularly in these early novels, in the presence of children who embody the continuing world after the protagonist's own death. So I'm just trying to move my slides along. Move too far, sorry. There we go. So we just have here a quotation from the protagonist and narrator of A Pale View of Hills, which is Ishiguro's very first novel. I won't read the whole thing out, but you can see, if you read it, that this is an illustration of the kinds of issues of death and reproduction and the children with which the protagonists of the early novels are concerned. So the children that we find in these early novels, with their awkward reminders of that unknowable continuity of the world and of the protagonist's own decisions and actions after their own death, challenge these narrators who seek to reconcile their interior and public lives with all that such a reconciliation might imply for their own moral responsibility. So Ishiguro's first two novels, A Pale View of Hills, published in 1982, and An Artist of the Floating World in 1986, which address the traumatic legacies of the Second World War and Japanese imperialism, are accordingly full of threatened, threatening, and indeed dead children. And these children's deaths tend to figure the irreconcilability of the protagonist's responsibilities to the continuing world with their internalized sense of self. So there's a failure of reconciliation that occurs, I think, when we find these children dying. And if you've read A Pale View of Hills, you'll know that it is indeed a novel rather full of dead children. But Ishiguro returns to these issues of death and reproduction and of what therefore might constitute a good life and a good legacy throughout his career. And perhaps surprisingly, Ishiguro's protagonists generally, although not quite exclusively, do become younger as his career matures and as Ishiguro himself ages, until in 2005, the narrator of Never Let Me Go contemplates her imminent death and the deaths of her loved ones from her early 30s. So quite a change from Mr. Stevens in The Remains of the Day, who's at a much older stage of life when he's contemplating his legacy and the limited period of life that he has left. Kathy H., the narrator of Never Let Me Go, is in fact a clone artificially created by scientific human intervention. So she is a kind of artificial intelligence herself, also created by her upbringing at the peculiar institution that is Hailsham. Kathy's young age and compressed lifespan make, of course, the issues of death and reproduction that are at stake even more tragically acute. So this is a change from Ishiguro's earlier aging protagonists, and there's also a change by the time of Never Let Me Go in how the young children who were contemplated with anxiety by those earlier protagonists are replaced by other forms of possible reproductive object in Never Let Me Go. And those forms include romantic partners, artworks, musical recordings, and eventually abject detritus, just masses of throwaway stuff. Now, Klara and the Sun, which is Ishiguro's second novel to be explicitly concerned with artificially created humans or quasi-humans, builds very closely on Never Let Me Go's themes, as indeed Richard has already alluded to. Yet, Klara is also Ishiguro's first extended and first explicit engagement with a religious disposition in one of his protagonists. There's very little explicit presence of religion generally in Ishiguro's novels until this point, although it does, a version of Christianity or early Christianity does feature in The Buried Giant, but it's in quite a different context, I think, to how religion appears in Klara and the Sun. So I want to explore now why Ishiguro's existing concerns with what we might think of as a very modern conflict between interior and public life, creating problems of moral responsibility that materialize through death and reproduction, find this religious dimension in his most recent novel. In fact, this dimension in Klara and the Sun appears to be invented spontaneously from within Klara's own mind. And the fact that she, as an artificial friend, an AF, is capable of such a massive and private epistemological act and philosophical judgment about the world is itself surely a warning against assuming that even created consciousnesses can be ever regarded as wholly predictable or incapable of private thought or private feeling. Klara's religious perspective arises in her understanding of the sun, which she develops from her awareness of her own dependency on sunlight, and she becomes to believe that she can make a sacrifice to the sun in return for his intervention to save her charge, Josie, from an early death. And Klara's sun has many of the qualities of God in Abrahamic religions. He is singular, omnipotent, inherently benevolent, he's male, he's judging yet forgiving, and he's responsive to personal prayer. And these are all qualities, again, that Klara has attributed to the sun, really completely within her own mind and on her own impetus. No one has indoctrinated her, at least not in any explicit or direct way. She has developed this sensibility and this set of beliefs about the sun. And Klara is quite fanatical in her faith in the sun. And of course, through that faith, she hopes to achieve a miraculous intervention to avoid Josie's otherwise very likely early death. And initially unbeknown to Klara, but of course she does find out later on, Josie's mother and the technologist Mr. Capaldi are simultaneously engaged in an alternative secular planning for a resurrection for Josie after her expected death, which will involve reusing and re-engineering Klara's artificial consciousness within a facsimile of Josie's body. And this, again, I think is an echo of how the clone's organs in Never Let Me Go were ripped out and redistributed to keep non-cloned humans alive. So there's, again, a kind of transference and reuse that is happening in Klara too, in an echo of the earlier novel. Now, I think that death and reproduction, when they arise in Ishiguro, always present his characters with an imperative to read other people and other objects for signs of assurance of their own security and ultimately of their legacy. And this has been an anxious concern that his protagonists have expressed and exhibited, again, since his early novels and pretty consistently throughout his work thereafter. This need to make the other who exists outside the self legible as a safeguard against the reality of death is an impulse to which Klara's particular interiority brings an acute and literal focus, one that's reflected in her constant ordering of her own field of vision, driven by this imperative to establish a legible order where empirical, visible reality and its significance, including its moral significance, are one and the same, where, if you like, public faces disclose private moral quality. And I'm struck, having heard Richard's reflections on the parallels between Klara and The Remains of the Day, and how Stevens, of course, has his own set of concerns with exterior appearances and how they relate to interior moral quality. And of course, for those who know Remains of the Day closely might remember that Stevens' own external appearance gets significantly misinterpreted at times and judgments made accordingly. So a number of echoes of Ishiguro's earlier work here that are coming out again in Klara. And Klara is a highly intense reader. She's constantly scanning objects and faces around her for signs of their nature and significance. And there are some quite disturbing instances of Klara seeking such moral legibility in the world, as she finds signs of evil in a bowl that she witnesses on a trip out with Josie's mother, in people engaged in quite banal conflicts on the street, and especially, of course, in the polluting Cootings Machine. Now, Richard referred to the Cootings Machine as sinister. I think I'd probably question that, because I think there are signs that the Cootings Machine might be pretty banal. So, of course, things can be sinister and banal, but I think Klara's judgments about this particular machine are very much open to question themselves, I think. Now, to be fair to Klara, we might consider that in our own societies, religion functions, as it does for her, as amongst other things, a way of reading life and death and organizing objects, including both other people and material objects, into hierarchies of guarantees about the future, ones that reflect our interior self and give it some kind of external reassurance about its continuity in the world. Religion makes other people legible through participation in shared values, creeds, and rituals that collectively seek to stem the pain of radical individuality and its ultimate evidence in the fact of death. Alternative secular ways of reading the other for assurance about the future do exist too, of course, notably in romanticized parenthood and romanticized adult relationships, both of which feature powerfully in Never Let Me Go and again in Klara and the Sun. Now, across all these forms, what I call authenticity operates as the belief in the legible coincidence of an object's materiality, its material presence, and its meaning. In Ishiguro, this notion of authenticity is somewhat challenged by the proliferation of inauthentic and artificial objects, including objects that look and function like humans, but which may be denied fully human status, like, of course, Klara herself, like Kathy H. before her too. And Klara is, however, somewhat ironically, very much a practicing believer in the moral importance of authenticity, in the sense that she believes that the outward appearance of things must properly represent their inner nature, even though her own outward appearance is, in one sense, and as is betrayed by the reactions of some humans to her, distinctly inauthentic, since it gives a human appearance to a machine. Nevertheless, Klara's personal religiosity is, in substantial part, about consigning objects, both living and mechanical, to moral categories that fit their visual experience. And we can see this in her thoughts when she sees the bowl, which I've got quoted here. And I will just read this because it illustrates it so well. So Klara says, "I'd never before seen anything that gave, all at once, so many signals of anger and the wish to destroy. Its face, its horns, its cold eyes watching me all brought fear into my mind, but I felt something more, something stranger and deeper. At that moment, it felt to me some great error had been made that the creature should be allowed to stand in the sun's pattern at all, and that this bowl belonged somewhere deep in the ground, far within the mud and darkness, and its presence on the grass could only have awful consequences." So we can see Klara developing a kind of theological vision here, a rather dark one, from her sight of the bowl. And she is invoking some pretty obvious heaven and hell imagery, alongside an implicit ecological moralizing about the extraction of raw materials from the earth and the consequences for doing so. So I think her religiosity is evidently a quest, as I'm arguing, for epistemological legibility. And this will also be a guarantee about reproduction, because her knowledge of the world, her understanding that she's developing, is intended to save Josie's life, because this knowledge, this theology, forms the basis for the bargain that she thinks she makes for the son in order to save Josie's life. Now, Klara's religious sensibility has a parallel in Capaldi and Josie's mother's rival attempt to save Josie's life. And their project is an uncanny reworking, I think, of Klara's naive insistence on authenticity, because it assumes that an outward replica and an internally preserved consciousness can be, as it were, seamlessly glued together, that any residual difference between them and any residual legacy from the raw materials from which they're made, including Klara herself, can be eradicated. Although this project is never ultimately put to the test, Capaldi and the mother are probably displaying, the reader might suspect, a naivety of their own in believing that this eradication of any difference between the reproduced and the original Josie can be effective. The likely persistence of such a difference between the reproduction and the original echoes the ambiguous role of material objects throughout this novel. The fact that Klara claims to see objects recognizable from her own past during her religious experience in Mr. McBain's barn shows both the significance to her of the limited range of objects she is permitted to hold and to enjoy during her life, and how a false belief in their authenticity, their being identical with some original, as she thinks the objects in the barn are, is an attempt to achieve some reassurance in the face of the knowledge of death and the contingency that it implies. So Klara's religion comes into existence, ironically, because of her own lack of externally legible interiority, which leads to her not being inducted into any human community of particular ideas about death and reproduction. The humans around her presumably assume there's no need for that, but as we can see how wrong they are. Yet Klara's status as an artificially humanized object ironically places her at the bottom of the hierarchy in which she herself seeks epistemological security. So there are multiple layers of irony in Klara and the Sun, which is very typical of Ishiguro's novels, where we always find those multiple layers of irony between the protagonist's own worldview and the circumstances that they're actually experiencing. I want to conclude by suggesting that there is another religious and ethical imperative that subtly emerges by the end of Klara and the Sun, just as it did in my reading earlier in Never Let Me Go as well. Now, given that Ishiguro invites us to think through religious frameworks in Klara and the Sun, we might characterize, I suggest, this imperative as a kind of radical Christian materialism, the imperative to give to others freely without restraint and without, crucially, prior assurance of a return on the investment. The life of Klara, like Kathy H. before her, suggests that to give something like a trip to the waterfall or a spot to stand in the sunlight or a space in the house can lead to the recipient making rather more of the gift than the giver ever imagined. And for those who know Never Let Me Go well, of course, the same is true with the tape and the other objects that Kathy and her friends obtain in the sales and exchanges at Hailsham. Now, giving here is done through faith in the potential of that giving or gifting to create new value for the recipient and for others, without demanding that the recipient visibly and legibly demonstrate their true nature as a prerequisite in order to receive the gift in the first place. And it is in this giving, I think, that Ishiguro seems to find the promise of a continuing world sustained even after the death of the individual. Giving in Klara's world is, of course, highly fraught, its terms defined by conflict over essentialist versions of human potential, like the potential to be lifted or not, to be given educational and economic opportunities or not. Yet it is giving with an acceptance of a degree of contingency and randomness in any potential to create continuing value in the lives of others that effectively replaces the sacrificial relationship that Klara attempts to establish with the Sun, rooted as the latter is in a sense of zero-sum inevitability about moral hierarchies, a zero-sum thinking that also emerges in discourses of authenticity. And there's a parallel there, I think, with the Christian idea of the transformational new covenant based on the idea of a free gift rather than a zero-sum moral economy. So the private interiority, resistant to penetration by demands for legibility that Ishiguro's protagonists have long displayed throughout his work, now becomes guaranteed by an rather uncannily displaced form of Christian generosity, one that also guarantees a continuing future, not as a reassuring mirror of the self, but as a shared material world whose potential lies to a significant extent in its very unknowability. And I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Splendid stuff. Thank you very much, Dominic. Just wait for Richard to come back on, and we'll take a quick look at the Q&A. If people start thinking about questions to pop in there to ask them. First of all, this is actually the first time we've all really sort of spoken to each other, which I think the people at home sometimes don't really realise. Do you guys have any questions for each other before we throw things open to the floor? Go, Richard.
Am I unmuted? I think I am.
We can hear you.
Yeah, that was a fantastic paper, Dominic. And I tried to flow what you said, and I'm really taken with your argument at the end that this is a sort of the potential for a radical sort of Christian materialism through sacrifice. And I think you're really onto something. And then that makes me think that Klara, Ishiguro is sort of having us ponder whether or not Klara could have small I incarnated Josie if Josie had died. She didn't in the end. And then I'm still thinking of the son as SON possibly. But I think that reading's really great, and I love your notion of the gift, the free gift. And I guess I would just add that Josie never really seems to realize Klara's sacrifice for her, and that's the best kind of gift, when nobody realizes what a sacrifice maybe you've done for someone. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Richard. And yeah, I think that's entirely right. And I like use of the word incarnation. I should have used that actually. But yeah, and I think there's, although of course Klara does seem to believe in the sacrifice that she's made and the effect of that, I do think there is some ambiguity around that as well, as to whether she genuinely believes that in the same way that she believed it at the time that she made the sacrifice with the son in the first place. I think that something has changed there, and I think her disposition and her thoughts when she's in the scrapyard at the end, and of accepting that distance from Josie and from the other people that she's been with, speaks to that, because that acceptance of distance and knowing that you have had a legacy in the world, but not needing to be identified with it, not needing to be one and the same as what's continuing, that seems to me to be the ethical imperative that Ishiguro is really driving towards, certainly in this novel, but obviously in my reading, really right from the start in the early 80s as well. I mean, I would share the same approach as you, Richard, in that I tend to very much read Ishiguro cumulatively throughout his career, and I always think that the latest novel is always about all of the other novels. And yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And finally, just to think a little bit more, if this is what Ishiguro's driving towards, of course, a great irony is that Klara's in the scrapyard at the end, and so are a lot of other artificial friends who gave all this service for so many years. So what are we to do with that, I wonder, with this great sacrifice or series of sacrifices that have all been scrapped? They're at the bottom of the hierarchy, as you said.
Is there some sense that Josie has become in some way a much better person because of her relationship, not only with Klara, but also with Rick, who is unlifted? That she seems much nicer than the other kids when they all come round with to visit earlier in the story, is that in some sense the lesson that Klara teaches her?
I think there may be a case for that. Yeah, I mean, I don't, even though in my comment a moment ago, I was suggesting that Klara's thoughts in the scrapyard are, you know, a kind of fulfillment of what Ishiguro's been driving towards for quite some time. At the same time, I wouldn't extrapolate that to mean that the ending is entirely positive and optimistic by any means. And obviously the fact that Klara is still in the scrapyard is a moral problem, as Richard has mentioned. And so, yes, I do think that Josie has learned from Klara, I guess, but I wouldn't want to straightforwardly celebrate that as a sort of key moral purpose of the novel, because after all, if you think about it in terms of servant and service novels, as Richard was doing, I think one is naturally a bit cautious about ever kind of endorsing that relationship as a kind of site of moral perfection, which of course is what Stephen starts off thinking that it will be for him too. So
yeah, and I would just add, of course, Klara sort of does it herself, but she moves, almost out of the house. She's in this small room by herself, and Josie seems to have largely forgotten her. She prepares for college, and maybe she is nicer in some ways, but she's also, as soon as she's healed, and maybe this is also what happens to teenagers, right? They become less dependent on us. I've got 2 boys in that situation now, but it bothers me that she does come to visit her and she does say goodbye to her, but I guess she doesn't really appreciate her, like in my mind, like she should, but in some ways, how could she? Right? Yeah.
Okay. We have a few questions coming in. Just before we sort of move to that, my own selfish question. I'd like to start with my own selfish question before we move to the people at home. Sorry about that, everyone. When I read the book, the thing that really struck me is in every single one of Ishiguro's books up to this point, he's always writing about memory. And he's very, very good at dramatizing the fallibility of memory, where characters argue over the precise details of what happened, or a character tells you a story and then says, oh, maybe it didn't happen like that. I can't really remember. It was a long time ago. With Klara, we have, for the first time, a narrator who is an artificial intelligence and whose memory seems to be largely infallible. And I wondered what your view on that would be. I mean, how does that change Ishiguro's project as a novelist? How does that affect our experience of the book?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, Colin. And I think it's an interesting observation about how different Klara's memory functions compared to Ishiguro's earlier narrators. I mean, I think Richard at one point it posed, or kind of implicitly posed the question of whether Klara is a reliable narrator. And there is a sense that she seems to have a more, if you like, more automated kind of memory recall than his other narrators would have. And so in that sense is more reliable. But at the same time, she obviously does huge amounts of misinterpretation. So she's certainly unreliable in the sense that she's misinterpreting, even if that's not kind of willfully lying in the way that it might be at times with some of Ishiguro's other narrators. I think she's driven by this need to make sense of the world in a very neatly connected way. I mean, I think the fact that she's always kind of piecing together her own field of vision seems to me very crucial to Klara's interiority and what that is about for us as readers. So there is that need for kind of neat ordering, and that obviously drives her to make misinterpretations and to be unreliable, just as indeed for ourselves as humans, we know that that we tend to make memories neater than was really the case. So yeah, I don't. That doesn't directly answer your question, but maybe it's region of it.
Possibly a very big question. Richard, did you?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I think, like Dominic, that we're more likely to trust Klara because she is an AI. At the same time, all the misperceptions that he pointed out that she goes through, all the mischaracterizations. I mean, the bull's just a bull. the bull's a bull in the field, right? But all of those should probably make us question her memory some and her narration. And I hate to say this because I love the scene, but having read Ishiguro long enough, I think we may even should question the scene where she says the sun comes into the room and illuminates her so strongly. There is some anecdotal evidence from the other characters that something happened that day. Is this wish fulfillment? Is she conflating memories? Did the sun come into the room another time? It's hard to know, but I think in this case, Ishiguro, I think he wants us to believe this scene as she's recorded it, let's say, as she's memorialized it. And even if it's not true, it's a true fiction.
There is some question as well after her encounter with the Cootings Machine. I got the sense that perhaps her brain wasn't working as well as it could be. I won't say too much about that, but you're just because I'm aware that we have someone in the audience who hasn't actually read the book. But yeah, there is some feeling that her powers are not quite what they were by the end of the book, and perhaps that's something. I think as well. There's that sort of wonderful scene at the end where she says she's putting her memories in order, which is a clear callback to Remains of the Day. Yeah. So we have a question from Marianne Donahue. She would like to know how could we categorize Klara and the Sun other than as fiction for library classification? I mean, I feel like I'm probably the best qualified to pontificate about that as a library worker. But what do we think? I mean, we've discussed genre as a question. I mean, if we were to file it as a non-fiction book, where would we expect to find it? Is it technology? Is it religion? Or
I mean, of course, the obvious answer is that I would far rather not categorize it if that was an option. And I think both for this and for Never Let Me Go as well. I mean, sort of dystopian fiction, of course, is an obvious potential category, but I think there are lots of problems with that as well. And it's interesting because obviously Ishiguro has touched on dystopian fiction. He's touched on sci-fi and fantasy as well in The Buried Giant, and sometimes been resistant to genre classification in interviews, and he's been accused of a bit of snobbery for that reason. But I mean, I'm a little bit pro Ishiguro, so I probably would tend to defend him. But I don't think that it's snobbery. I think that those classifications are obviously potentially quite restrictive, and if you put something in the category of dystopian fiction, it's already setting up certain assumptions about what it means to be in a future world, actually, that I think are not necessarily applicable here. So yeah,
I would add to what Dominic has just put so well. He said in interviews, especially when The Buried Giant came out, I mean, he was attacked.
He was, yeah,
by a number of people, including in the New York Times for, I think one phrase that was used was, this is a sort of ham-handed fairy tale. And, but again, I think I agree with Dominic. He likes to confound not only our expectations about narration, but our expectations about genre. And he likes to explode those. And I think well, I'm not going to get the interview right now, but anyway, someone who was interviewing him around that time, maybe it was Neil Gaiman, said, he expressed to Gaiman his frustration with being put in a box generically, and he doesn't like that at all. And so then that's the moment when he sort of starts retrospectively saying, well, Remains of the Day was actually a fantasy novel of sorts. Like, what? I thought it was a confessional novel. I thought it was this. I thought it was that. And so I think he takes great pleasure in confounding our expectations, like on I don't know how we would place this or categorize it.
I am familiar with that interview. That's Mary. Yeah, that's in the New Statesman. You can find that on their website, with Neil Gaiman, and it's very interesting. They talk about the invention of genre.
Right.
When Lord of the Rings came out, it was just another novel.
That's right.
It just happened to be about dwarves and dragons and how these things exist, really, so that we know where to go when we get to a bookshop to get the book that we want. And that's it. That's really, fascinating. Question from Susan Morgan. Does the novel suggest science in this fictional period of history went too far, with robots taking people's jobs and the seats in the theatre? The manager doesn't seem surprised that Klara is there in the scrapyard, suggesting this was a brief experiment without a future. Well, there's a take. What do we think? Is this a book? Is this the traditional science fiction trope of science has gone too far? And possibly we can bring into this. I mean, I think Richard, you mentioned earlier that it was you saw it perhaps as an environmental novel.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I could see that the validity of that question. I absolutely agree with its premise, and in other ways, I think he's telling us that we've gone too far in the sense that this creation, in the context of the novel that we invented, is actually more like us and renders or levies a sort of judgment on us, right? And so because we're so uncomfortable with its nearness to us, its similarity to us, that we tend to push it away, and we want to keep it at arm's length. So in some ways, by privileging her point of view with all of her mischaracterizations, as Dominic pointed out, and her misperceptions, by privileging her as the sort of emotional and even, I would say, moral center of the novel, he's suggesting that maybe we haven't evolved enough in the way in which we treat each other. So I don't know what Dominic thinks.
Yeah, I mean, my general sense is that it's never the technology that is evil. In Ishiguro, it is always what humans are doing with the technology. I know that sounds kind of a bit cliched and obvious, but I think that's a sort of starting point. I think, there are various reasons why that's the case, but one thing I would draw attention to is that Ishiguro's protagonists tend to grow up in very particular environments or particular institutions. And those environments are mediating their experience of the world, including, the role of technology, whether that be the technology that actually makes them up as entities or is just, around them. So Klara, of course, we find her in the shop, and that's where she seems to, as it were, grow up. Kathy H, of course, grows up at Hailsham, and Stephen spends all of his life, or almost all of it, inside Darlington Hall. So to me, that feels very much like drawing attention to the institutions, the environments that mediate that use of technology, and it's through their rules, through their internal culture, through the way that they operate within the world, because of course we tend to find out later on that these are actually very protected environments that are not in fact typical of the broader world, but occupy a very particular place within it. All of that seems to me to be Ishiguro kind of coming down on the side of saying it is human history, culture that mediates this stuff, and not, the technology itself in any kind of essentialist way. So that's my sense on it.
Mm-hmm. What do we make of the American setting of the novel? Thinking about where it's set, because I think it's his first novel set in America. I think it's his first book since Remains of the Day that even acknowledges the existence of America. And I think, although it doesn't explicitly say where it's set, I think through the vocabulary that's used and the types of landscape and cities that he describes, that it feels like a very American environment. How does that? And it also seems like a story that, with very few tweaks, could be set anywhere. Like it could be set in Essex, or it could be set in Nagasaki, or it could be set in any of the other places that he's written about? Why this particular setting?
I guess
Richard, as token American, maybe.
I guess I didn't pick up on that, is my honest answer. That didn't resonate for me, and I'd like to think that I'm attuned to that sort of thing. That it's very clearly not England, as he said, as I pointed out with all Helen's discussion of hedgerows and the rest of that. But it's if it's not England, I guess I'm not convinced it's America. If it is, it might be a sort of stereotype of America, sort of unbounded space, gridded, a sort of gridded plan. But the barn, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's because I watch too much Scandinavian noir. I mean, it could be in the countryside. I don't know. But
it's interesting that there's been an assumption that it's set in America, and reading a lot of reviews and interviews and things. But I got to think about this the other night and went through the book, and at no point explicitly does he say what country it's set in. It's quite uncanny.
Yeah, and again, I guess my initial answer would be that Ishiguro might be leading us towards that conclusion, I suppose, but only to confound it, much as he does with genre. I think it could be almost anywhere outside of England, let's say. And then someone mentioned, I thought it was America because the diner they go to. Well, there you go. So maybe there are some indications. I don't know. I haven't really read the reviews. I've tried to stay away from them, but I'll start assiduously reading them after this. He's probably not said, has he, Dominic, in interviews? Yeah.
About the American setting. I don't know, to be honest. I don't recall any specific comment on that. I do think it's obviously striking that it's his first novel set in America. Now, I think it is the United States, personally. Now, obviously, Ishiguro's settings are never fully the real thing, just as the city of the Unconsoled isn't really a city in Eastern Europe, and the Shanghai of When We Were Orphans isn't the real Shanghai, and so on. But I think on a surface level, at least, I think it is the US, personally. As people have commented in the chat, there are quite a few Americanisms that would point in that direction, as well as, of course, things like the layout of the city, which is clearly much more like an American city than a British or European one. And of course, we also know that England is elsewhere in the novel. It's not where they are. I can sort of see the scholarship that's going to come out on Klara and the Sun lined up already. So I know that someone is going to write the thing about Klara and the Sun as an ecological novel. Someone is going to write the thing about it as an American novel. Someone may write the thing about it as a religious novel. We'll have to see whether that's me or someone else or whatever. But so I'm sure that someone is going to have a full reading of Klara and the Sun as a novel with an American setting. I've talked to others about this, actually, and no one that I've talked to has come up yet with a fully developed reading. I mean, we were struck by things like the fact that Melania is this significant character in it, Melania housekeeper, and of course it was written during a period when the First Lady was Melania, so we were wondering about that, but couldn't come up with any particular developed reading of that. I do think that there were interesting things that connect it to the current United States. So there are references to communities that have almost segregated themselves off, and that have protected themselves with arms to do that. So that seems quite connected to some of the more dystopian readings of certain developments in the contemporary United States. But as I say, I don't have a kind of full reading of that to offer yet. I would say, just as one possible criticism of Ishiguro, and I may be wrong about this, but I do wonder whether the American English in it is not actually completely consistent, because I noticed quite a few phrases in there that I thought, despite the setting, sounded more British than they did American, and I wonder whether that's just because Ishiguro doesn't quite have his American
It's
English
sofa
down.
and couch interchangeably, and there is something a little bit sloppy about it, like whether that's intentionally so, and he's trying to cast ambiguity on it, I don't know. We have a question that possibly follows on from this quite well, and this is from Beth. She asks, can either of you comment on race in the novel? She's noticed several occasions in the text where a person was specified as being non-white, and she wondered if this was something that you've noticed in your readings, and also whether race is a recurring theme in Ishiguro's work. And she adds, this is all based on the assumption that Josie's family is white, which again is never specified. So what are your thoughts, gentlemen?
Richard, do you want to go first on that one, or should I go?
That's a tough one. I can try.
Possibly it connects with the sort of the Trumpian, or the hints of Trumpian politics in the little that we know about the world that they live in.
It's tricky again because I keep feeling like Ishiguro may court these parallels only to subvert them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would have to think some more about the question, but I think when it does come through, it is always bound up. I want to go back to this notion of the hierarchy that Dominic mentioned earlier. It seems to be bound up with questions of who's been lifted and who hasn't been lifted, for example. And of course, we don't know what it means to be lifted for a long time. And then it turns out that it means genetically edited. So, there's past horrific examples of, as we all know of genetically editing, say, people who were thought to be of supposedly inferior races. Mm-hmm. I suppose in this case, if you think that Josie's family is white and some of the elite kids that are, say, at that party with her are, in this case, it seems to be actually those folks who are actually have attempted to lift themselves through gene editing. So it's a reversal of, say, past historic injustices in that sense, but with the result that some people such as Rick have been left behind because his mom, I think properly, didn't choose to genetically edit him. And so, of course, that they have been lifted has wreaked havoc on their system. Sal's died, Josie almost dies. So I think I would start by answering it there, but I haven't thought enough about the question, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was only going to also draw attention to Klara's tendency to create hierarchies and to establish associations between the visible world around her, as I was referring to, and her assumptions, her kind of moral hierarchies about the world. And there are instances where she reacts to someone's visible appearance in a racialized way. So although it doesn't necessarily pursue that directly too far, I think you do certainly get a hint of something disturbing about the potential of that. So yeah, I think that's probably all I can say on it. Yeah.
So how about in the context of some of his other books? Obviously, he was born in Japan and then moved to England when he was 5 years old, and a lot of his books seem to be. I mean, I know he kind of eschews any kind of biographical sort of interpretation, but there's always this sense of someone who is a bit lost, trying to make sense of a world that they don't understand. And I do wonder if that experience in his early life, really forms him as a writer, and it sort of comes out. I think his writings on race, for me, come out often in very, very subtle and unexpected ways. Like there's a lovely quote from an interview, which I forget where it's from, but he describes like consciously trying to write like a slightly iffy translation of a book that was originally written in another language. And just to have that sort of sense that, you're reading some obscure French novel that's, and this sort of sense of being one remove or being an outsider trying to be an insider, or an insider that's really an outsider. He's very good at in and out groups. I suppose that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I always stress when I teach Ishiguro, especially Reigns of the Day, his not only his background but in Japan, but also the British upbringing, and then the fact that he was both a beater at Balmoral, I believe, for the Queen Mother, and worked as a social worker. So he sort of it kind of reminds me of Chaucer in a sense, sort of being immersed in these the old medieval concept of the estates, right? The highs and the lows and the rest. And so there is that sense, like you're saying, Colin, of him being lost in a way, but then it seems to me the best writers are always these observer figures who are really good at sort of identifying groups on the fringes. And along those lines, I would just point out that while the characterization of Josie's father seems negative, he actually is the one parent who's consciously resisting what Dr. Capaldi wants to do. So anyway, I think he's a gifted observer, partly because of his immersion in all these different situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I have too much to add to that. Of course, your quotation of the comments about the iffy translation does put a different spin on my comments a moment ago about his version of American English. So, there's obviously a debate there about.
There's always this kind of awkwardness, and it comes across like he's a bit overly polite, or there's a wonderful story about how he was at school at the age of 5 and he learned English from watching sort of cowboy films. And so he'd be going to go to this English primary school expressing himself like, "Sure, partner," because that was the English that he'd learned. And having to figure out that actually this is not quite how you are meant to express yourself to your teacher when you're 5 years old,
Yeah. I've actually written a little bit about Japan in A Pale View of Hills, which of course is set in both Japan and in the UK. And that as a 1980s novel. And Japan in the 80s, from a British perspective, occupies quite a peculiar position, because the Thatcher government, which was still quite in its infancy at the time that novel came out, of course is very nationalist and very racist, to be blunt about it, and anti-immigration. And that includes being opposed to East Asian migration, which, because there were various panics over things like Hong Kong at the time. But Japan is this kind of great capitalist success story, which of course was what the Thatcher government was also trying to emulate. So there's a kind of paradox there that puts the identity of Japan from a kind of conservative British perspective in the 80s, when Ishiguro starts his published career, in quite a peculiar position. So that perhaps speaks to the awkwardness that you've referred to as well, and that sense of being, an observer who might be treated as an outsider, and someone who's difficult to categorize, like his fiction, as we were saying a moment ago. But Ishiguro clearly does have quite a broad view of British society and the British class system, and which is referred to the Balmoral thing. So,
he's one of the few sort of big name writers who sort of has this quite working class, sort of not quite comprehensive school background, but he's certainly not, of the sort of Julian Fellows kind of class, like he is kind of one of us,
He's not public school, certainly. Even though a few of his characters are, or a kind of, Hailsham, of course, is a kind of monstrous public school. So, but
I was quite surprised when I found that out, because he's written so much in that sort of milieu. But we are sort of coming to the end. There was one question from the beginning of the session that we didn't quite get to, which we could go to quickly, and I've held back on it because it exposes the fact that I haven't read this book. But Ian McEwan wrote a book called, I can't even remember the title, Machines Like Me or something, was it? Yeah, Machines Like Me. And I'm going to mispronounce your name as well, Sian. I'm really sorry. It looks like Sian has asked this question. Yeah, can we compare it to the In Cootings Machine's Like Me novel? And if, again, this exposes that anyone else hasn't read it, are there any other books, you know, that we could recommend that connect with Klara and the Sun in some way, or that come to mind that we'd like to compare it to?
So just on the McEwan one, I must admit it does expose that for me, I'm afraid. So because I saw that question come up, but I don't feel qualified to answer on that specifically, I'm afraid.
That's fine. I mean, I think Ishiguro hasn't read it either. I mean, like, he deliberately, like, no, I don't want to know what Ian's doing, you know, on this topic. I mean, the book that it reminded me of more than anything else was Daniel Keyes' Flowers for Algernon, which I'd like to put a word in to those at home, which was originally a short story that I think won the Hugo Prize and got extended into a novel. I think the short story is far superior. You can download the PDF of that without too much trouble. But it's a very Ishigurovian kind of narrator, if you will.
Well, thanks for that tip, Colin. Yeah. By the way, I don't know whether Richard's waiting. Can I just mention, I've seen there is one other question in the Q&A, Colin, about girlhood. So I don't know if you wanted to come to that one.
Where was that?
In the Q&A as opposed to the chat.
Right.
It's always great when people find the Q&A. Right, I couldn't help but consider when I was reading the book, the theme of girlhood in the text. How much do you think, pertaining to each of your topics, genre fluidity and faith, contribute to Ishiguro's exploration of maturity and growing up in the context of the artificiality of Klara's body, especially in contrast to the fragile body of Josie for the majority of the text?
Gosh, that is a really rich question.
Can we do it in 5 minutes or?
Oh, that's, yeah, maybe I'll try to take a stab at it. It's a great question. It looks like, again, my sense when I started the novel, I have to keep going back to my first impressions, was that you would have an unchanging AI and a changing human. In fact, what we have is a changing human and a changing AI. And so it turns out that while maybe Klara's body doesn't change, she does seem to, as Dominic said so well, she seems to acquire emotions, sympathy, maybe even empathy, love. She seems to acquire faith. So I guess I'm still wrestling with how all that evolution in her interacts with this question of the materiality, even small I incarnation that we were talking about earlier. I might put those two in play, I think. So there's an evolution or there's a devolution, if you like, in Josie's body. And then, of course, she's healed and she does better. But I don't see, I suppose, the growth in her that I do in Klara. And I think Klara is a much fuller and richer character by the end, even though I think Josie has grown. And then I'm wondering how these emotions, which of course we can't see, and this faith, which we can't see, interacts with the materiality of that sort of milieu that Dominic was talking about. So I have more questions than answers on that.
Yeah,
it's always nice to go home pondering questions that we can't quite answer here. Do you have anything to add there, Dom?
I don't really, I'm afraid, but I think, really rich question, rich answer from Richard too, but I don't think I got more.
Well, should we wind up there? I'd like to thank everybody for coming along tonight. I hope you've enjoyed our talk. Big thank you to Dominic and Richard for all of your amazing hard work in putting this together.